before you relax and drift into this story, I just want to ask you one thing. If you enjoy my voice and the story itself, please let me know in the comments. It really means a lot to me.
They say winter is the season of silence. But for a medieval peasant, winter didn't bring peace. It brought the sound of empty stomachs. Imagine waking up to frostbitten mornings in a drafty wooden hut, knowing that the small sack of barley in the corner has to last you and your family until spring. No grocery stores, no heating, no safety net, just cold, hunger, and the hope that what little you preserved in autumn wouldn't mold, rot, or run out. The question isn't just what did they eat? The real question is, how did they survive? Let's step into the world of the medieval peasant. Not the glamorous castles or the bustling market towns. No, we're going to the edge of the forest, to the muddy, narrow paths, to the villages forgotten by time. Here, survival was a day-to-day struggle, and food wasn't about taste. It was about staying alive. Winter began with fear. Autumn was a race against the clock. If you didn't harvest enough, if the weather betrayed you, if blight struck the crops, you were in trouble. You see, medieval peasants didn't store food for luxury. They stored it because they had to outwait death. So what filled their bowls in the coldest, harshest months? Bread. But not the golden loaves we imagine. This bread was dark, coarse, dense, made from rye or barley, sometimes mixed with whatever flour they could find, sometimes even ground up tree bark when times were desperate. It was baked in communal ovens when there was enough firewood, which wasn't always the case. Porridge was another staple. Boiled grains, mostly oats or barley, sometimes flavored with a pinch of salt if they had any left. No milk, no sugar, just warm mush to fill the belly and ward off hunger for a few hours. And then there were turnips. So many turnips. They were hardy, easy to grow, and could survive underground during the cold. Eaten boiled, mashed, or thrown into stews when available. But even a turnip could feel like a feast if your pantry was bare. Now picture this: no fresh fruits, no leafy greens. Scurvy was a quiet enemy, creeping in as vitamin C vanished from their diet. They didn't know the science, but they felt the symptoms. Bleeding gums, weakness, constant fatigue. It wasn't just the cold that drained them. It was the slow starvation of their bodies. Meat? Rare. Unless you were poaching game in the Lord's forest, an act punishable by death, or lucky enough to keep a pig alive until slaughtering season. Salting and smoking were the only ways to keep it through winter, but even that required resources many peasants lacked. Most meat went to the nobility. The peasants? They might have seen meat a few times a month. Maybe. Beans and legumes were more realistic. Dried broad beans, peas, protein in a world where strength meant survival. But beans alone couldn't warm you when snow covered your roof and the wind howled through the cracks in your walls. And then there was ale. Weak, often sour, brewed at home. It was safer than water, which was often contaminated. Even children drank it, not to get drunk, but to avoid disease. And sometimes, that cloudy, bitter brew was all they had to drink when the rivers froze. Salt was gold. It preserved meat, flavored food, and was so valuable that families would trade what little they had to get it. But when salt ran out, so did preservation. Mold would creep into stores. Rats would chew through the thatch. Spoilage was a silent killer. Imagine looking at your last sack of dried peas, knowing it has to last 3 more months. Imagine feeding your children smaller portions each day, hoping they won't notice. Imagine going to bed with your stomach aching, praying spring arrives early. But even in the harshness of winter, there were flickers of resilience. Peasants used ingenuity to stretch what little they had. They dried herbs in autumn, parsley, thyme, maybe a bit of garlic, to give flavor to the blandest meals. They stored apples in cellars, wrapped in straw to keep rot away. They smoked eels caught from streams, fermented cabbage, dried mushrooms from the forest. Every scrap was a lifeline. There were communal feasts during Christmas, times when the village came together, pooling their reserves for a single day of warmth, fire, and shared bread. For one night, they could remember what it felt like to be full. But then back to the cold, back to the rationing, back to the waiting. We often romanticize the medieval world. castles, knights, noble quests. But the truth is, most people didn't live those stories. Most people were peasants. Their lives were small in scope but immense in endurance. And their winters were brutal tests of patience, planning, and pain. And even then, there were years when winter won. Have you heard of the Great Famine of 1315? It wasn't just one bad harvest. It was 3 years of relentless rain, crop failure, and starvation. By the second year, people ate their seed grain. By the third, some ate bark. In the most desperate villages, stories emerged of people eating the flesh of the dead. That wasn't winter. That was horror. But it happened. And it wasn't the only time. So next time you complain about not knowing what to eat for dinner, remember them. The peasant who clutched a bowl of barley porridge and called it a blessing. The child who never tasted sugar. The mother who gave her portion away so her baby could live another day. They didn't eat for pleasure. They ate to fight death. And winter was the battlefield. Still, amidst all this hardship, there was rhythm. A cycle the peasants had come to understand. Nature, cruel as it was, had its patterns. If you knew the signs, if you listened closely, the land whispered when to gather, when to sow, when to store. For peasants, survival wasn't about strength. It was about knowing time. Before the first snow fell, families worked like a machine. Root vegetables were dug up and buried in pits lined with straw, deep enough to avoid the frost. Cabbage was fermented into something sour but long-lasting, sauerkraut, before it had a name. Onions and garlic were braided and hung from ceiling beams, both food and medicine in one. Everything had a place, a purpose. Waste wasn't just foolish, it was fatal. And when the snow came, they waited. Daylight was short, chores were fewer, and life slowed to the rhythm of firelight. They told stories. They mended tools. Children learned old songs while fingers stitched rough cloth. But even in stillness, hunger lurked. A family could go from comfort to crisis in a week if the food store turned or if a sickness spread. One bitter truth was that winter didn't treat everyone equally. A peasant family with strong sons, a bit of land, and maybe a pig could scrape by. But widows, orphans, the old, they faced a different winter. Charity existed, but it had limits. The church might offer a few loaves. The Lord might permit some gleaning of the fields. But not always, not every year, and not enough. In the depths of winter, food became memory. You remembered the taste of summer apples or roasted lamb, not because they were common, but because they were gone. A dried apple slice was a treasure. A spoonful of honey was a dream. Most peasants rarely tasted sweetness unless nature offered it, like a rare wild berry or sap from a tree. Sugar, that was the stuff of kings and crusaders. Sometimes hunger led to invention. Peasants turned stale bread into soup, dried out porridge to reheat days later, brewed weak ale from leftover grain. Necessity made them creative. Even bones, gnawed and boiled, were used to flavor broth. And the lucky ones might have kept a chicken alive through the snow, its occasional egg a burst of life in a gray season. And yet, despite everything, people endured. There's something haunting about imagining a child licking the bottom of a wooden bowl, not because the food was delicious, but because it was rare. Or a man walking miles through snow to gather frozen firewood, because his family's breath was starting to frost. These weren't acts of heroism. They were acts of routine, quiet defiance against nature. And nature didn't always wait for spring to show her hand. Sometimes the thaw came too late. Sometimes it brought disease. When snow melted into mud and cold turned into damp, sickness spread like wildfire. Coughs that started in December could turn fatal by February. With weak bodies, empty stomachs, and no real medicine, a simple illness became a death sentence. A chill became pneumonia. A fever became mourning. Still, when the first green shoots appeared, wild garlic, nettles, the tiniest hints of life, peasants gathered them like gold. These early greens didn't just feed them. They reminded them they'd survived. Not all, but some. And survival wasn't just physical. There was spirit. There was faith. The medieval peasant didn't just live by bread alone. Religion ran through every part of life. The church bell marked the hours. Saints were called upon to protect the crops. Fasting was a form of discipline, but for many, fasting days were no different than ordinary hunger. And when Lent came in late winter and meat was forbidden, it wasn't sacrifice. It was simply life continuing as it always had. The line between faith and necessity was blurry. Imagine this. It's February. The stores are nearly empty, and Lent begins. You're told to fast, to eat less. But how can you eat less when there's already nothing left? You kneel anyway. You whisper your prayers. And you thank God for the one crust of bread that remains. Faith wasn't a luxury. It was fuel. And somehow, despite the suffering, people laughed. Weddings were held in winter. Babies were born. Songs were sung around fire pits. There was joy, buried like the roots of winter turnips. Deep, hidden, but alive. Always alive. The medieval peasant understood something we often forget. Life doesn't have to be easy to be meaningful. They didn't endure winter to complain about it. They endured because there was no other choice. And they did it with a kind of quiet dignity that we, in all our modern comfort, might never fully understand. They knew that hardship wasn't an interruption of life. It was life. And when spring finally came, it wasn't just a change in weather. It was resurrection, a second chance, a return of light, warmth, hope. The fields would thaw, the animals would give birth, the world would breathe again. But winter always waited. It would return. And so each year the peasants remembered what to plant, what to dry, what to hide from the cold. They passed on these lessons not in books, but in hands, in calloused fingers teaching younger ones how to twist herbs, store roots, survive the silence. And maybe, just maybe, the deepest hunger wasn't for food at all. Maybe it was for continuity, for knowing that despite the frost and the dark and the empty bowls, life would go on. It always had. But what happens when that continuity breaks? Not every winter followed the script. Some years, rain came early, flooding the granaries and soaking stored grain. Other times, frost arrived too soon, killing the late crops before they were pulled from the ground. And once in a generation, there were winters so cruel they turned villages into graves. You've heard the tales of wolves howling closer to the edge of the village, of families disappearing into silence, of entire fields that never turned green again. They weren't myths. They were memories, passed down like warnings, because medieval peasants feared many things. Lords, taxes, sickness. But nothing terrified them more than the long, empty cold. There's a kind of hunger that gnaws at your bones but doesn't scream. It whispers. It makes you forget the taste of anything real. It makes you dream of bread, not to eat it, but just to remember what it felt like to chew. That kind of hunger changed people. It turned neighbors into strangers, sometimes even enemies. In desperate winters, theft was common. A single turnip could mean survival. A sack of barley left unguarded could be the difference between life and death. And if someone was caught stealing food, justice was swift, harsh, public, not to restore balance but to set an example. Hunger was no excuse. But secretly many understood, because they had felt it too. In small ways, people tried to shield one another. A hidden loaf passed to a sick neighbor. A warm broth shared with a mother who'd lost her husband. These weren't acts of charity. They were acts of solidarity. Because if one family failed, the village might falter. And in winter, a weak village was a dead one. Still, there were rules. Unwritten but known. Everyone worked. Even children. Especially children. A 7-year-old might be sent to gather sticks or watch the last hen, her feet wrapped in cloth to keep out the frost. Elders wove stories not just for comfort but to teach, to prepare the young for the winters they too would one day face. And then there were the seasons of war. It's easy to forget, but sometimes the greatest threat to a peasant's winter wasn't nature. It was other men. When armies marched, they didn't carry food. They took it. Villages were stripped bare. Granaries emptied. Pigs slaughtered. If soldiers came through in autumn, the harvest was stolen. If they came in winter, they burned what they couldn't eat. And when the soldiers left, winter remained. But the food did not. What did a mother tell her children then? That spring would still come? That somehow God would provide? That hope could be boiled like soup? Some stories survived from those winters. Stories of eating shoe leather. Of boiling weeds. Of digging through snow for any root, any seed, anything. But there's one story that comes up again and again of bread made from ground acorns, soaked and boiled to remove the poison. It was bitter. Hard. Almost inedible. But it filled the belly. Peasants remembered that bread. Not because it tasted good, but because it saved them. And that's the thing, survival leaves behind a legacy. You might not see it, but it lingers in the recipes, in the rhythms, in the quiet reverence for food that rural communities still carry today. The idea that wasting bread is a sin, that feeding a stranger is sacred, that winter must be prepared for always. That memory is older than any book. And through it all, you begin to see something else. Not just hunger, not just hardship, but wisdom. Medieval peasants didn't have science, but they knew what worked. They knew how to ferment vegetables, how to dry herbs, how to keep root crops from freezing. They knew to slaughter animals before the first deep snow, to render fat for tallow, to hang meat in the smokehouse and pray for no early thaw. They lived by instinct, by practice, by knowledge paid for in lives. And their wisdom wasn't individual. It was shared. Stories were passed like seeds, recipes like prayers, advice like protection. Because in winter, you didn't survive alone. You survived together. So when you ask, what did they eat? You're asking the wrong question. What did they lose? What did they remember? What did they endure? Those are the real questions. And they begin to explain why food to a medieval peasant wasn't just nourishment. It was history. It was love. It was hope with salt on it. You might be wondering, if life was so hard, why didn't they just leave? Go somewhere warmer, somewhere richer? But that's not how the medieval world worked. A peasant was bound to the land, to the seasons, to their lord. Movement was rare, risky, often illegal. Most people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born. The village was their universe, the forest their border. And winter, the test that came every year, without mercy, without delay. Leaving wasn't freedom. It was exile. And exile in winter was a sentence worse than hunger. So they stayed, and they adapted. One of their most powerful tools? Community memory. In some villages, elders were living encyclopedias of food preservation. They knew which berries soured too quickly, which tree bark could be ground safely, how long to boil dried beans to avoid poison. They didn't have books. They had scars. And scars remembered. Sometimes a new trick appeared, someone learned to store carrots in layers of ash or discovered that dried rose hips kept longer than apples. These secrets passed from mouth to mouth like spells. Because in winter, the right knowledge wasn't just helpful. It was the difference between a child's laughter and a funeral bell. And still, every winter brought its own surprises. A rat infestation, a cracked grain jar, an unexpected freeze, a broken tool that couldn't be replaced until spring. Every small disaster had the weight of tragedy. And yet, there was a kind of poetry in how they endured it. Picture a man carving new handles by firelight while his wife quietly patches worn cloaks from scraps. In the corner, a toddler gnaws on a dry crust. No one speaks, but no one needs to. Everything is said in the silence of survival. And once again, the question echoes, what did they eat? Not just turnips and porridge. They ate effort, patience. They chewed on the years behind them and swallowed the hope of the year ahead. They consumed their own discipline, their own restraint. Because if they ate too much today, they might not see next week. There were no cheat days in winter. Holidays were the only exception. If any food was saved, if anything was smoked, dried, salted, or buried deep enough to endure, the feast days became sacred moments. A slice of pork on Christmas. A boiled egg at Candlemas. A spoon of lard stirred into stew on a saint's day. Not because it was indulgence. Because it was tradition. A ritual of resistance. These tiny celebrations reminded them who they were. Not just victims of winter, but stewards of survival. Children of rhythm. Keepers of memory. Even death had a rhythm in winter. Burials were delayed. Graves dug slowly into frozen ground. Sometimes bodies were wrapped and stored in barns until the earth could be pierced again. Morning was quiet. There were no florists, no songs, just a cold field and the hope that next year there would be fewer losses. And yet life never stopped. Children were born during the longest nights. Babies arrived in the silence, screaming new life into the frost. And the midwives came, tired, half-starved, wrapped in wool, to deliver hope with trembling hands. They carried herbs in small pouches, whispered prayers under their breath, and lit fires with urgency. Because if the baby cried, there was a chance. And in winter, even a chance was a miracle. And then spring returned. It always did. But for many peasants, spring was not joy. It was another trial. Because food stores were gone, and new crops hadn't grown yet. This period, March and April, was sometimes the hungriest of all. Known in later centuries as the Hungry Gap, it was the cruel irony of survival. You endured the worst cold only to face an empty field. Wild greens helped. nettles, dandelions, the first leaves of wild garlic. People ate what animals grazed on, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. The hunger of early spring was desperate, quiet, exhausting. And by then, your body was already weakened by months of poor nutrition. The danger hadn't passed. It had only changed its shape. Still, the soil began to soften. The first seeds were planted. Rain fell instead of snow. Chickens began to lay again. And hope, real hope, tiptoed back into the village. But every survivor carried winter inside them. A kind of memory in the bones. A whisper that said, store more next time. Prepare better. Teach your children. Never forget. Because winter would come again. And that's what shaped them. Not just their meals, but their mindset, their culture, their faith, their art. Everything was touched by that cold, silent season. Even their stories. Fairy tales were dark for a reason. Witches in the forest. Starving children. Curses of endless cold. These weren't fantasy, they were echoes of real fear. Warnings carved into bedtime. So that no one would forget what hunger looked like. What it felt like. What it cost. Imagine this, it's a night in late January. The fire is low. The last of the onions are gone. There's a pot of something simmering, watery, thin, with a faint scent of dried herbs. A single candle flickers. A child coughs in the corner, wrapped in all the cloth the family owns. You don't know if spring will come soon enough. But you still stir the pot. You still feed your family. Because even when there's almost nothing left, you give what you can. That was the power of the peasant's will. And food was never just food. It was history. It was ritual. In some villages, certain dishes were made only on certain days because they marked the calendar, grounded time. A thick barley porridge might mean it was the feast of St. Agnes. A lentil soup might mean you were halfway through Lent. These meals weren't about luxury. They were about orientation. In a world where time blurred in frost and mud, food gave meaning. And meaning gave strength. Sometimes, when the food ran low, peasants turned to the land in ways most of us would never imagine. They foraged. Not with baskets and books, but with instinct and desperation. They knew the bitter leaves that wouldn't kill you. The bark that could be ground into something resembling flour. The fungus that grew under dying logs and whether it would heal or harm. The line between medicine and poison was thin. But they walked it daily. There's a record, written centuries later, of a village that boiled moss scraped from rocks. Not for flavor. Not for nutrition. But because boiling something, anything felt like hope. And sometimes people prayed. Not to be saved from hunger, but to have the strength to endure it. Because no angel ever came down with baskets of bread. The miracle was not in divine intervention. It was in each other. There are whispers in the old chronicles of bread shared between strangers, of lords who opened their stores in bad years, of monks who risked disease to deliver stew to the dying. These stories are rare. But they shine. Because kindness in winter wasn't expected. It was extraordinary. But just as often, there was cruelty. Some lords taxed the poor even harder when times were lean. Some churches refused aid unless tithes were paid. Some neighbors turned away the hungry with locked doors. Winter was a mirror. It showed what people truly were. And yet, even those who were hardest hit found ways to carry on. The human body can survive astonishing things. But the human spirit, that's where the real endurance lives. When a mother fed her children and went without. When an old man gave his last loaf to his neighbor's baby. When a boy walked miles through snow for a sack of dried peas that might never be enough. These were not legends. These were real. Because history isn't made by kings. It's made by people like this. We don't know most of their names. We never will. Their stories weren't written, but they lived them. In soot-dark kitchens. In frostbitten fields. In the silence between hunger pangs. And sometimes, just sometimes, a miracle did happen. A calf born in winter that survived. A patch of mushrooms found under old snow. A neighboring village sharing what little they had. These moments weren't just luck. They were reminders. That life, even in its bleakest season, finds ways to go on. But winter left marks. Not just on the body, but on the culture. On the soul. Generations raised on scarcity became cautious. Frugal. Superstitious. They saw signs in the sky. Omens in the behavior of animals. They feared comets, eclipses, sudden warm spells in midwinter. Because anything unusual could be a warning the next winter might be worse. And sometimes it was. Famine didn't come every year. But when it did, it changed everything. Families shrank. Villages vanished. Those who survived remembered, and they taught their children to prepare. That's why the cellar was more sacred than the church. A well-stocked root cellar was salvation. Inside it, potatoes covered in straw, dried apples strung from rafters, smoked meat wrapped in cloth, barrels of sour cabbage and ale. Each item a promise that the world might not end today, that your children might have something tomorrow. And in this world of scarcity, one thing became more precious than all others. Salt. Salt preserved life. Literally. It cured meat. It brined vegetables. It kept the rot at bay. Without salt, there was no survival. That's why it was traded like gold. That's why entire roads and wars revolved around it. A bag of salt in the right moment could buy a life. And yet, some winters came when even salt couldn't help. Spoilage. Disease. Theft. Mold. One broken jar could mean a lost month of food. And in that cold logic, you begin to understand how deeply fragile life was. How every choice, every seed, every sliver of meat mattered. And yet they kept going. Because that's what people do. They kept going because they had no other choice. But also because, deep down, they believed something better might come. Maybe not for them. Maybe not this year. But someday. This belief, quiet, stubborn, persistent, was stronger than hunger. And so, they passed it on. A mother teaches her daughter how to tell if a root is too far gone. A grandfather shows his grandson how to tie up onions so they dry without rotting. A neighbor leans over a garden fence and warns, plant late this year, the frost came early last spring. It wasn't education in the modern sense. It was memory, woven into rhythm, learned by doing, passed by watching, remembered through need. And winter was the greatest teacher of all. You learned quickly what worked and what didn't, what froze and cracked and what lasted, which herbs soothed hunger and which made you sick, which neighbor would trade a bucket of turnips for a worn-out boot. Everything had value because everything could mean one more day of warmth, one more breath, one more chance. Even garbage mattered. Bones were boiled not once, but 2 or 3 times until all the fat was gone. Crumbs were gathered. Cabbage water was saved for soup. You didn't throw away what might still feed someone because you never knew what tomorrow would take. The rich, of course, had no idea. In manor houses, the fire never went out. Meat was served year-round. Their cellars were full. Their tables groaned under feasts. But even they, in the worst years, felt the tremble. A failed harvest didn't just starve the peasant, it raised the price of grain. And when grain became gold, even lords grew nervous. But peasants didn't wait for prices to drop. They adapted. They learned the bitter art of substitution. No wheat? Use rye. No rye? Use acorn flour. No flour? Boil bark. If it didn't kill you, it could keep you alive. And this wasn't just desperation. It was innovation. It was resourcefulness. You wouldn't call it cuisine, but you'd call it survival. And in its own way, it was brilliant. That's the part we forget sometimes. We imagine medieval peasants as backwards, helpless, ignorant. But they were chemists without labs, doctors without books, engineers with no machines. Every time they stored food for winter and made it last, they were winning a war against time, rot, and nature itself. And yet, that war never really ended. Winter always came again, always knocked at the same crooked door. And each year, it asked the same question. Are you ready? Sometimes the answer was yes. And sometimes it wasn't. But even when they weren't ready, they tried. They stretched what they had. They leaned on each other. They invented, they hoped, they prayed, they suffered, they endured. And that is where their greatness lies, not in conquest or glory, but in this invisible, intimate resistance. Because winter was not just a season. It was a shadow. It crept into bones, into bread, into lullabies. It shaped the calendar, the family, the very shape of villages. It sculpted the soul of the people. Even their faith was winter-colored. They prayed for warmth, for light, for spring, but not loudly, not in grand cathedrals, quietly at home, beside the fire, hands clasped with cold fingers, not asking for miracles, just for enough. And when spring did come, when the buds returned and the birds sang again, it wasn't joy they felt first. It was relief, a soft, almost guilty relief, because they had made it, again. But they knew deep down it wouldn't last. The sun would warm them, yes. The trees would blossom. The fields would bloom. But winter would return. It always did. And that knowledge, that quiet fear, that memory of cold in the corners of their mind, that was the real meal they carried. All year long. Even in summer. Even in summer, they thought about winter. The warm months weren't a time to relax. They were a race. A countdown. Every sunny day was a chance to gather, grow, and prepare, because they knew every berry not picked, Every vegetable not stored, every mistake in timing, could echo months later in the form of hunger. So they moved like clockwork. Peasants rose before the sun and worked past dusk, not for wealth, not for ambition, but for survival. You could almost feel the weight of winter in their every motion. Each bundle of herbs hung to dry, each cabbage planted with care, each sack of grain checked and rechecked. All of it whispered, "Not yet, not safe, not ready." And among them were those who remembered the bad winters, the ones that took too many. Their memories sharpened the urgency. The year the pigs died early. The year the stream froze solid and never thawed in time. The year snow came in October and the stores were still half empty. These people became warnings. They'd mutter at the young, "Don't waste those scraps." They'd scold over spilled flour like it was blood. And when others laughed at their worry, they'd just say, "You weren't there." But even among the careful, nature was cruel. A single hailstorm could ruin weeks of planting. A sudden flood could rot a whole harvest. A drought could turn hopeful green fields into dust. And when that happened, when the system failed, peasants turned inward, tightened belts, made new plans with less. And the food changed too. They might thin their stews, replace beans with leaves, add more water to the barley gruel. Not to deceive but to stretch, to trick the stomach, to survive long enough to reach the next chance. You start to see the depth of this life, not just in what they ate but how they thought. Time itself was built around the question, will we have enough? And in that question they found discipline. Even children were taught restraint. No sneaking food, no indulgence. Hunger wasn't a punishment. It was part of the rhythm of life. And when food was plenty, you didn't feast. You saved. You shared. Because tomorrow's feast might be famine. And yet, despite all this, they still found beauty. Imagine a mother humming while peeling dried apples, her voice soft in the twilight. A boy chasing chickens between crooked garden beds. A grandmother slicing dried mushrooms, telling stories of winters long past. These small moments, so tender, so ordinary, became resistance. A way to say, we're still here. And the meals they created, they weren't lavish, but they were full of meaning. A loaf of sour rye bread shared at dusk. A bowl of hot cabbage soup thickened with lard on a cold evening. Dried apples simmered with honey on a holy day. These were not just meals. They were memories, anchors, celebrations of what was still possible. Because survival wasn't just about not dying. It was about remembering who you were. Even at the bottom of the food chain, even in the dead of winter, peasants created culture. Through their recipes, their rituals, their shared effort, they built a form of dignity that no hunger could erase. And they passed it on. A stew recipe whispered to a daughter as she stirs. A trick for storing onions told to a boy gathering straw. A quiet blessing spoken before breaking bread. None of it written down, all of it remembered, until the next generation took it as their own. That's how they made winter survivable, not by changing it, but by building themselves into something that could endure it. They became winter creatures, hardened, quiet, clever, with hearts that beat not in hope of spring, but in the rhythm of each other. And yet, even the hardest hearts had soft places. Because hunger changes people, but it doesn't erase them. There are stories, whispered between generations, of peasants who, despite their own need, shared what little they had with someone worse off. A crust of bread to a wandering stranger. A bowl of soup left by a church door. A child fed while the mother starved quietly nearby. These acts weren't celebrated. They weren't even always noticed. But they mattered. Because in a world ruled by cold and scarcity, kindness was an act of rebellion. There were no medals, no songs written, just a choice to be more than what the world demanded of you. And in these choices, they preserved something even rarer than food: humanity. Still, not every story had light. There were winters where the snow came early, and the animals fell ill, and the dried stores rotted from dampness. Winters when desperation pushed people to things they would never speak of again. The church would say hunger was a test. But in those long, frozen nights, it felt more like a punishment. Some sold the only things they had left: their dignity, their tools, their future. Others wandered into the forest and never came back. And some simply went quiet, slipping from life as if sleep had claimed them. Because the cold didn't always kill quickly. Sometimes it waited, but still the living moved forward. Not triumphantly, not always bravely, but steadily. They repaired the same coats again and again. They patched their shoes with twine. They drank thin broth and imagined it thick. They prayed, even if they doubted. Because even doubt was something. Even doubt was survival. And when the snow finally melted, and the first green shoots pierced the earth, it wasn't celebration they felt first. It was disbelief that something could grow again, that color could return to a world that had been all white and gray and brown, that the trees could hum with bees and the rivers sing with thaw. Felt like waking from a dream, a long, cold dream, but they didn't dance. They didn't shout. They worked, because spring was not a reward, it was a responsibility. It meant planting, fixing, digging, hauling. It meant preparing for the next winter, even while your hands still remembered frostbite. And that's the truth no history book tells you, that medieval peasants didn't live season by season. They lived winter to winter. Everything in between was just preparation. So when they planted seeds in spring, they weren't thinking of summer feasts. They were thinking of snow, of firewood, of root cellars and sacks of grain and smoke from the chimney. They were always thinking ahead, because the ones who didn't make it. And this forward thinking became something deeper, something more than habit. It became identity, a kind of quiet, practical philosophy. You survive winter not just by enduring, but by outsmarting it before it begins. That's what shaped them. Not the hunger itself, but the planning that kept it at bay. The wisdom passed from hand to hand, mouth to ear. The rhythm of the seasons etched into their muscles. The instinct to save a little, to stretch a little, to check the sky with eyes that remembered. And in this way, winter didn't break them. It built them. What did medieval peasants eat in winter? The simple question opens a door into a world both harsh and beautiful. A world where every meal carried weight, every bite was earned, and every flavor told a story. They ate what the earth gave them, yes, but also what time preserved and human hands saved. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and parsnips were staples, pulled from the frozen ground or dug from cold, dark cellars where they'd kept through months of frost. These weren't the sweet, crisp versions we know today. They were earthy, tough, sometimes bitter, but nourishing enough to keep hunger at bay. Grains were everywhere: barley, rye, oats, ground into coarse flours or boiled whole into porridge. Imagine a thick, bubbling pot of barley gruel, simmering over a low fire. It wasn't a feast. It was warmth, sustenance, a shield against the chill. Legumes, beans, and peas played their part too. Dried and stored during summer, they rehydrated in stews, slow-cooked to soften their tough skins and fill empty bellies. A simple dish, but one that could stretch a family's food supply for days. Salted and smoked meats, if the peasant was lucky enough to have any, were prized treasures. Maybe a hunk of salted pork or a piece of dried fish. Meat was scarce in winter, not just because animals were harder to raise in cold months, but because preserving it required skill and precious salt. And what about dairy? Cheese and butter were often made in the late summer and autumn, then stored carefully. These provided rare bursts of flavor and calories when fresh milk was impossible to get from frozen cows. Foraged foods, as desperate as it sounds, were essential. Mushrooms, wild herbs, tree bark, even the inner bark of certain trees, could be used as emergency sustenance. Not all of it was pleasant. Not all of it was safe, but it was a lifeline. Spices? Almost unheard of for peasants. The taste of winter was humble, marked by whatever herbs grew locally: parsley, garlic, dill, onions, dried and preserved. These added faint whispers of flavor to otherwise plain meals. Bread, the heart of medieval diets, was a constant companion. Not the soft white loaves of today, but dense, dark rye or barley bread, sometimes mixed with bran or acorns. It was filling and it lasted. Every meal was a lesson in frugality and creativity. The peasants' winter table was a testament to endurance, an everyday miracle of turning scarcity into something sustaining. But it was more than nutrition. Food in winter was also about ritual and community. Gathering around a fire, sharing a stew or a loaf, was an act of connection. It was how families passed on stories, how they marked time, how they survived not just physically but emotionally. And within these humble foods, there was history, encoded in recipes handed down, in the way ingredients were combined, in the timing of harvest and storage. This was a survival story written in roots and grains, in salt and smoke, in quiet moments beside a flickering flame. It's a story that challenges our modern ideas about food and abundance. It asks us, what would we eat if everything else was gone? What would we hold on to? How would we care for each other? The medieval peasants' winter diet wasn't just about hunger. It was about resilience, and that resilience still speaks to us today. Winter was not just a season to survive. It was a test of human ingenuity, patience, and the bonds between people. Imagine a village blanketed by snow, the air so cold it bites the skin, the fields buried under thick ice. Inside each humble cottage, the peasant family gathered close to the hearth. The fire was the heart, not just of warmth, but of hope. Their meals were simple, but they carried the weight of the entire year's labor. The bread they broke had been kneaded months before, using the last of the autumn grain. The stew bubbling in the pot was a slow concoction of whatever root vegetables, dried peas, or salted meat they had left. It might lack flavor, but it was rich in meaning. Every bite was a victory, and yet, even in this stark reality, there were moments of unexpected abundance. Sometimes, a successful hunt would bring fresh venison or rabbit to the table. Other times, a neighbor might trade honey or a jar of preserved berries. These moments were treasured like gold, brief flashes of joy against the backdrop of winter's long shadow. But it was not just food that sustained the peasants. It was the knowledge of the seasons, the rhythms of the land, and the community's shared effort. They planned their planting and harvesting with a precision born from necessity. They preserved food carefully, understanding which roots keep best in straw, which fruits dry well, which meats can be salted or smoked. Every action was part of a larger strategy, a strategy of survival. And in that strategy, they found a strange kind of freedom. Because in preparing for winter, they claimed a measure of control over an uncontrollable world. They faced the dark months not as helpless victims, but as warriors armed with knowledge, tradition, and sheer determination. And it was this fierce determination that carried them through. The winter diet of medieval peasants wasn't just about eating, it was about enduring, about making something out of almost nothing, about facing the cold and hunger with quiet courage. It was a story of survival written in the language of root cellars and dried herbs, in shared loaves and whispered prayers. And it's a story worth remembering, because in the harshest winters, when every bite counted, the peasants taught us something essential, that resilience is built not on abundance, but on resourcefulness, not on luxury, but on love and perseverance. And maybe that's the greatest lesson from their winter tables. So if you found this glimpse into the past meaningful, don't forget to subscribe and join the journey of uncovering history's hidden stories. Winter was a season of silence and waiting, but it was also a season of stories. In the flickering firelight, families gathered not just to eat, but to remember. Tales of past winters, harsh and mild, cruel and kind, were shared with reverence and sometimes with a shadow of fear. Stories of lost loved ones who never saw spring again. Stories of miraculous survivals, of neighbors who saved one another with a loaf of bread or a secret root patch. These stories wove the fabric of their community tighter than any walls could. The food on their plates was part of that tapestry. It was more than sustenance, it was memory. Every dried apple slice, every handful of barley, every scrap of salted meat carried a story of summer's sun, autumn's toil, and winter's endurance. This connection to food was visceral, immediate, and deeply human, and it shaped the peasants' relationship with the earth in profound ways. They didn't see the land as something to conquer or exploit. They saw it as a partner in survival, sometimes generous, sometimes cruel, always demanding respect. Their winter diet reflected this delicate balance. Nothing was wasted. Leftover broth was saved. Scraps were fed to animals or composted for next year's fields. Even the bitter, tough foods were valued for the life they gave. It was a cycle of give and take, and it taught patience. Because no matter how hard winter pressed, no matter how long the nights stretched, spring always came again. The promise of renewal was etched into every seed they saved, every root they stored. And in this cyclical hope, peasants found a quiet strength. A strength that has echoed through the centuries to our modern world. So when we look back and ask, what did medieval peasants eat in winter? We uncover a story of survival, yes, but also a story of connection, resilience, and hope. It reminds us that even in the darkest, coldest times, life finds a way, and that sometimes the simplest meals carry the deepest meanings. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe to keep exploring history's hidden layers. As winter's grip tightened, the peasants' daily life became a careful dance with scarcity. They rose early, often before dawn, and spent their days tending to chores that the cold allowed. Fetching water from wells that sometimes froze at the surface, chopping firewood that was precious and limited, and checking their root cellars, where the winter's sustenance waited in darkness. These cellars were lifelines, cool, damp, but safe places where turnips, carrots, onions, and cabbages were stored. The very earth itself became a pantry, preserving what summer had given. But even these stores were fragile. A poorly sealed cellar meant rot. Too much moisture invited mold. Too little ventilation spoiled crops. Every mistake could mean hunger. Every success could mean survival. The peasants' relationship with food was a constant negotiation between nature's generosity and its cruelty. And the methods they used to preserve food were ingenious. Salting was a common technique for meat and fish, a process that drew out moisture and kept spoilage at bay. Smoking added flavor and extended shelf life. Drying herbs, fruits, and vegetables under the eaves of their homes was a daily ritual. Even fermentation played a role, turning cabbage into sauerkraut, which not only lasted longer but provided vital nutrients when fresh vegetables were unavailable. It's easy to forget, in our modern world of abundance, how precious and precarious food was. But to medieval peasants, every preserved carrot, every smoked hunk of pork, was a small victory against winter's hunger. And this struggle was mirrored in their cooking. Stews were a staple, a way to combine whatever ingredients were available into a hot, filling meal. Thickened with barley or oats, flavored with wild herbs or scraps of meat. These stews were rarely luxurious but always comforting. They were meals born of necessity, yes, but also of creativity and care. Because feeding a family through winter was not just about eating. It was an act of love. A way to say, we endure, we survive, we keep each other alive. And in that simple act, the harshness of winter softened just a little. This is the hidden power behind the medieval peasants' winter diet. Not just what they ate, but how they ate it. Together, with care, with resilience. And that is a story worth remembering. If you want to uncover more hidden tales from history, be sure to subscribe and stay with us. Winter was not merely a test of physical endurance, it was a challenge to the spirit. In the long, cold nights, when the world outside was silent and frozen, peasants found warmth not just in fire, but in rituals that bound them together. Meals became more than food. They were moments of connection. The family gathered close, sharing what little they had, passing bowls and breaking bread together. The flickering shadows on the walls seemed to listen in, carrying stories from one generation to the next. And in those moments, the bitter cold retreated, even if just for a while. But winter was also a time of reflection. Without the distractions of planting or harvesting, there was space to think, to dream, to plan. Peasants would mend tools by candlelight, repair clothing, and prepare seeds saved from the previous harvest. Each task was a promise, a hope that the cycle would continue, that spring would return. And yet, beneath this hope, there was often a quiet fear, because winter was unpredictable. A sudden early frost, a failed harvest, a harsh blizzard, Any of these could tip the balance from survival to despair. This tension between hope and fear was woven into every meal. A stew might be stretched thinner one day, saved for another. Bread rationed carefully, every crumb accounted for. In these choices, the peasants revealed a profound resilience. They knew that winter was long, and survival was a marathon, not a sprint. This resilience shaped not only their diets but their worldview. They learned to live with uncertainty, to plan for the worst while hoping for the best. And in doing so, they forged a strength that still speaks to us today. The medieval peasant's winter diet is more than a list of foods. It is a story of human endurance, creativity, and the power of community. So next time you sit down to a meal, remember the strength behind every bite, the countless generations who faced the cold and hunger and found ways to carry on. If you want to hear more stories that connect us to the past, subscribe and join us on this journey. When we think about what medieval peasants ate in winter, it's tempting to imagine endless hardship, gray and cold and bleak. But beneath that surface was a world rich in subtlety and survival strategies, shaped by centuries of trial, error, and adaptation. Take porridge, for example. A simple dish, made from oats, barley, or rye, boiled in water or thin milk. But it was so much more than just sustenance. Porridge was the glue that held the day together. It was eaten at dawn to chase away the cold, at midday to fuel hard labor, and at dusk to settle the stomach before sleep. The texture was thick and hearty, sometimes sweetened with wild honey or dried fruit if the household was lucky. But often, it was plain and filling, a comfort in the long, dark months. The act of cooking porridge over a slow fire, stirring the pot, smelling the steam, was a ritual of care, a moment of calm in an otherwise harsh day. Then there were the root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, and carrots, stored underground or in cold cellars. These hardy plants were the backbone of the winter diet. They could be roasted, boiled, or mashed, transforming their tough fibers into something softer and more nourishing. And when combined with barley or dried peas in stews, they created a meal that was simple, yes, but capable of sustaining life. The peasants had little room for luxury, but their resourcefulness turned scarcity into survival. Even the humblest ingredients were treasured and used with respect. Salted pork, when available, was a prized treat. It was salty, chewy, and rich in fat, the kind of food that could keep a family warm from the inside out. Dried fish was another form of protein, especially in coastal or riverine areas. Preserved by salting or smoking, it was a lifeline in the months when fresh meat was scarce. But winter food was not only about physical nourishment. It was about community and ritual. Harvest festivals before the cold set in were moments of joy and gratitude, celebrations of survival that promised food for the winter ahead. Sharing meals with neighbors, trading goods, and pooling resources were essential acts of solidarity. These social bonds were as crucial as the food itself, knitting communities together against the loneliness and threat of winter. So the medieval peasants' winter diet was a story of more than hunger. It was a story of connection, ingenuity, and hope. A story that reminds us that even in the toughest times, life persists. And in that persistence, there is a lesson for us all. If you want to dive deeper into history's hidden stories, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more. The cold of winter was not just an external force. It was something that penetrated every part of a peasant's life, including their food. But the medieval peasant didn't surrender to the cold. Instead, they fought it with every tool and tradition at their disposal. One of the most remarkable aspects of their winter diet was the use of preserved foods carefully prepared in the warmer months to last through the dark times. Salt was the most precious preservative. Without it, meat and fish would spoil quickly. But salt was expensive and not always easy to obtain. So peasants learned to combine preservation methods. Smoking meat or fish over smoldering would help add flavor and keep spoilage at bay. Drying fruits and herbs under thatched roofs or in smokehouses allowed them to store vitamins and flavor. Pickling was another method. Vegetables like cabbage were fermented, turning them into sauerkraut, a tangy, sour food rich in nutrients that could stave off scurvy. It's easy to overlook the brilliance behind these methods. They were not simply about making food last, they were about survival, health, and even joy, because preserved foods added variety to what would otherwise be a monotonous winter diet. They brought taste, texture, and sometimes even celebration. Preservation also required foresight and planning. Peasants had to harvest and prepare foods before the first frost. They had to know how much to save, how much to consume fresh, and how to store it safely. This knowledge was passed down orally, a treasure of wisdom encoded in stories, songs, and everyday practice. And it was essential, because one wrong mistake, a poorly sealed barrel, a forgotten batch of salted fish, could mean weeks of hunger or illness. The stakes were high, and yet, despite these challenges, peasants found ways to nourish themselves through the coldest months. They transformed humble ingredients into meals that fed not just their bodies but their spirits. And this is why their story matters, because it shows us that resilience isn't just about endurance, it's about adaptation, about using knowledge, community, and creativity to survive hardship. It's a lesson that still resonates today. In the quiet of a medieval winter evening, the humble peasant's meal was more than mere nourishment. It was a ritual, a moment of solace amidst hardship. The fire crackled softly as the family gathered around, bowls in hand, savoring a thick stew rich with barley, root vegetables, and perhaps a morsel of salted pork. The aroma was earthy, smoky, simple, but it spoke volumes. It told a story of summer fields now buried under snow, of hands that had tilled the soil and gathered the harvest with sweat and hope. The stew was thick and warm, a balm against the cold and a reminder of what the earth could provide even in its quietest season. Yet, winter meals were not always abundant. Many times, families faced days when food was stretched thin: porridge for breakfast, a small bowl of broth at midday, a handful of bread and onions at night. Hunger was a constant companion, a shadow lurking at every meal. But even in these moments, there was dignity and care. The act of preparing food, sharing it, and sitting together was a statement of resilience. Said, we endure, we survive, we keep the flame of life burning, no matter how fierce the storm. And this resilience was often strengthened by faith and superstition. Many peasants believed that food had protective qualities, that sharing a meal could ward off evil spirits, that certain herbs could bring health and luck through winter. These beliefs added a layer of meaning to their food, making every bite part of a larger spiritual and cultural tapestry. It's easy to overlook these subtleties when we think about medieval peasants, but they mattered deeply. Food was not just calories, it was comfort, connection, and hope. And through winter's longest nights, these small acts of sharing and preparation kept communities alive. They remind us that food carries power far beyond the table, connects us to each other and to the world around us. It tells stories of survival, creativity, and love. So when you think about what medieval peasants ate in winter, remember this: their meals were more than just food. They were life itself. As the snow deepened and the days shortened, the medieval peasant became a master of making do. In a world where nothing came easy, every scrap mattered. A bone from a slaughtered pig, long since stripped of its meat, might still be boiled into broth again and again until it gave up every last trace of flavor. The resulting soup, thin but hot, warmed hands and bellies alike. Even the water wasn't wasted. It was reused for cooking grains or soaking legumes. Waste wasn't just frowned upon, it was dangerous. Wasting food meant tempting starvation. Children were taught early not to leave crumbs. A crust of bread dropped on the ground was retrieved, dusted, and eaten. Bread, in fact, was more than food. It was sacred. It had to be stretched and protected. Coarse black bread made from rye or barley, dense and heavy, could last longer than softer wheat loaves. If it went stale, it was soaked in broth or milk. If it molded, the mold was scraped off and the rest salvaged. And yet, there were moments of sweetness. In households that kept bees, honey was a rare but treasured delight. Not for daily use, but for holy days or special gatherings. A spoonful might be added to a pot of porridge, transforming it into a celebration. Herbal teas were brewed from dried leaves and flowers. Mint, nettle, elderflower. Not for luxury, but for warmth and health. A hot mug of infused herbs could soothe a sore throat or calm a restless child. Even in the bleakest moments, the human spirit searched for comfort. Candles were precious, often made from tallow, smoky and foul-smelling, but giving just enough light to extend the evening. Meals taken by firelight became moments of quiet reflection, the crackling flames the only sound in a world wrapped in snow. Outside, everything slept. Fields lay bare, trees skeletal, rivers slowed to a trickle beneath ice. But inside, life persisted. Meals became rituals of hope. Each bite was a message to the world. We are still here. And every day survived brought the next one closer to the first signs of spring. On the coldest nights, when wind slipped through the cracks in the walls and the fire burned low, hunger felt like a second skin. Not the sharp pang of a missed meal, but the slow, dull ache of a stomach stretched too thin for too long. In these moments, peasants turned to what was left. The ends of things. The last handful of dried peas rattling in a wooden bowl. A few slivers of smoked lard scraped from cloth. A heel of bread so hard it needed soaking for hours just to chew. It wasn't a meal. It was survival in its rawest form. Yet even then, people found ways to make it matter. They would gather close, families, neighbors, huddled not only for warmth, but for presence. Silence was shared. So was story. Because when food was scarce, stories became nourishment. Tales of warmer seasons, of saints and spirits, of foolish kings and clever peasants who outwitted fate. These stories filled a different kind of hunger, the kind that made you believe you might still wake to a better day. And sometimes the stories weren't just entertainment. They held memory. They reminded children what plants to gather in spring, what signs in the sky meant thaw, what rituals might protect a flock or a child or a home. So the line between food and knowledge blurred. Both were necessary. Both were passed down hand to hand, mouth to mouth. And sometimes, when the winter eased just slightly, and the snow grew soft under the sun, there would be a strange kind of joy. Someone might find a buried onion in the storage pit they thought was empty. Someone else might catch a squirrel or a bird. It wasn't much, but it was more than nothing. And in that moment, it was everything. The meal that night would feel like a feast, not for its quantity, but for its symbolism. It meant the land still gave. It meant life continued. And for those who had endured the long dark, that small sign was enough to keep going. With every passing week, winter tightened its grip, and the peasants' world grew smaller. The roads vanished beneath snowdrifts. The fields became oceans of white, frozen and still. Even the village well might freeze, forcing people to melt snow just to drink. Everything slowed, movement, speech, time itself. But inside the cottage, life continued around the fire. Food preparation became a careful ritual. A single pot might be kept simmering for days, with new ingredients added when available. A bit of dried cabbage, a spoon of lard, some oats if fortune allowed. These dishes changed constantly, reshaped by what remained. They weren't recipes. They were improvisations. There was no waste. Bones were boiled until they crumbled. The marrow, if any remained, was extracted with care. Ashes from the hearth were sifted, and sometimes used in preserving or cleaning. Even animal fat had many lives, first as food, then as light, then as balm for cracked hands. Winter demanded patience. Every bite was earned. But there were moments when the snow stopped falling, when the sky cleared and a pale sun touched the earth again. Those were the days when hope peeked through. Children might be sent to gather twigs or brush. If the rivers had thawed even slightly, some would check for fish. Sometimes a trapped animal, caught in a handmade snare set days before, could mean meat, and with it, strength. No one ate alone. Food, when found, was shared, because isolation meant death. But unity could stretch even the thinnest stew a little farther. And with each small act of sharing came something more valuable than the meal itself: trust. That trust, that bond, was the real foundation of survival. In the harshest season, it wasn't just the earth that turned hard and unforgiving. It was life itself. But peasants didn't fight winter. They worked with it, learned its moods, studied its signs. A change in wind, a certain birdsong, the way smoke drifted in the morning. All of it meant something, because winter in their world wasn't just weather. It was a teacher, and its lessons were written in hunger, in silence, in frost, but also in endurance, in generosity, in firelight, in bowls passed hand to hand across the table. Sometimes survival depended on nothing more than memory. Memory of where the last turnips were buried under straw. Memory of which corner of the cellar stayed coldest and driest. Memory of the exact moment last year when the ice on the stream began to crack. These memories weren't written down. They were stored in people, in their bodies, in their stories, in their habits. And they made the difference between seeing spring or not. By midwinter, the strongest supplies were already low. Salted meat was nearly gone. The pickled vegetables, once so plentiful, had dwindled to brine and scraps. The bread was harder now. Some loaves were mixed with ground beans or peas to make the flour last. This was the lean time, a dangerous time. Even healthy peasants began to feel the slow drain. Their skin grew pale, their movements sluggish. Children stopped growing. Teeth loosened. Illness crept in like smoke under a door. Quiet, choking, relentless. In the absence of green vegetables, scurvy loomed. People turned to remedies passed down for generations. Dried rose hips, if they'd been clever enough to gather them in autumn. Elderberry tinctures. Sour pickled cabbage that still held the whisper of a summer sun. And when food failed completely, there were darker options. Some foraged bark, boiling it to extract what little nutrition it held. Others chewed on leather, old shoes, belts softened by hours of boiling. It wasn't food, but it filled space. It quieted the noise of an empty stomach. Then there were the truly desperate. Some left the village in search of food elsewhere. They didn't always return, not because they perished in the snow, but because they found work, found shelter, found something beyond the village that called them away. Winter could dissolve not just food stores but families. And yet, not every night was bleak. There were evenings when a neighbor arrived with broth, unasked. When someone with a hidden store of apples offered one to a child. When laughter echoed again, sudden and real, even if just for a moment. These were the nights that kept people going. Because in the absence of plenty, kindness became the greatest wealth of all.